Hello everyone, thank you for being here. I love you. So I wanted to do a video on, well, I didn't want to. My guides were really guiding me to do this video on death. What happens when we die, right? And I was really hesitant about doing this video. I don't know why, I just really didn't want to discuss it or talk about it, but here I am talking about it. I want to preface this by saying that there are an infinite amount of ways to experience, process, understand the death journey. What happens when we, the higher consciousness, leaves the body, okay? So I am not the expert at this. I am just sharing a perspective of what occurs. There are many perspectives and there are many experiences that happen when the soul or higher consciousness leaves the body. There is no direct way. There is no right way. There is no, oh, this is absolutely what happens, okay? There are many questions around this. I am just going to share what I have been provided by the Galactic Federation of Light, okay? So this isn't about right or wrong or arguing different paradigms. This is just about what I have received. So let's begin by remembering that we're higher consciousness. We came from some other higher dimensional realm. And we chose to drop into this physical body that we are in right now, experiencing this dense third dimensional, fourth dimensional field on an earth plane in physical form, okay? Everything that we are experiencing, for the most part, has been designed by us, the higher consciousness, okay? So we also have an ego, personality, mind, and we have free will. So when we drop into the body, although we have created a sort of divine blueprint, the way in which we would like our life to unravel in human form, the ego, personality, mind aspect of you is going to steer the ship for a while. The higher self is going to do its job to try to navigate you, but the ego is going to be involved. And so there's going to be all these turns and twists that you're going to take, right? And there are many times where you are shifted back onto track, onto the right path, right? What's that word that I'm trying to think of where you're moved back in, right? Reverted, whatever the word is, I can't think. But many times the ego takes us in all these different directions and it's like, get back, right? When you die, when death occurs for the human, most of the time that is also designed. Okay? Not all the time. Again, remember, this is not the truth for every human, but for most humans, death is designed. The time frame is typically designed, meaning that the higher consciousness will say, I only want to experience 5 years and this is what I'm going to experience, right? Now, the time-space continuum can be experienced differently than what the higher consciousness is asking. For instance, a higher consciousness comes in and says, I want to have 5 years of a human journey, and the human lives actually for 15 and then passes, right? Because the ego, personality, and mind is also involved and will navigate the journey and will perhaps move about and not go on a straight path, right? But eventually that higher consciousness will have a shorter lifespan than many other humans. Okay, it's chosen. This is very challenging perhaps for people to understand, but it is chosen. Many times the way in which the death process occurs is chosen. And there are many incidences where it was an accident, okay? The ego chooses a direction, chooses a path, and the higher self is trying to redirect, that's the word, redirect the human back on path, but the ego doesn't hear it, and the ego ends up accidentally passing, okay? That happens as well, right? So trying to figure out, did this person choose it or was it an accident? You're never gonna know, okay? What I can say is the majority of deaths that occur in the human form on the earth plane is designed. It is chosen. Okay, give or take some years, it's chosen. And this is challenging, okay? Because we're looking at young children, we're looking at teenagers, we're looking at young moms and dads, right? There's so many things that we can look out at externally and say, that doesn't make sense, I don't want to accept that. And you don't have to, right? This is a much higher perspective on what is occurring during the death process, okay? And when we are anchored in a 5D consciousness, 5D humans choose their death. They choose the moment they die, and they don't actually physically collapse or die or hurt or any painful thing, right? They just choose to exit out of the physical body, and the physical body remains on the earth plane, right? So there's no pain, there's no suffering, there's none of that. Which leads me to the second point, which is many, many humans, when they pass, they don't actually feel the pain that we think they feel. Now, this isn't all, but many. They actually leave the physical form before the physical pain. So it's almost like when the snake gets the head cut off, right? And the snake is still moving, but that the head is gone, right? It's sort of similar to that. The body is still going to have its natural responses based on the organs and the blood that's still moving through, but the higher consciousness has exited out. And the higher consciousness is actually looking over the body, kind of watching this last few moments of death, right? We don't understand this because we may never have died. However, if you've had a near-death experience, you've probably seen this. You've probably moved above your body and watched your body move through that death process. So you're not actually feeling the pain. Okay, the human doesn't necessarily feel it. Now, this is not for everyone. There are humans that stay longer in the body and feel some of that pain. But they end up leaving the physical form before the physical form actually conks out and is done, shuts down, okay? So that can be a comforting thing, right? Now, the third point is that when the consciousness leaves the body, it's like an energetic light. Okay, because you are light, your higher consciousness. And you actually leave and exit out of the body through the channel. And when you exit out through the channel, you find yourself first in this, it's almost like a holding zone, they said. It's like in between worlds. It's a dimensional field, and it's a vibrational space that's sort of anchoring you still close to the earth plane, but also close to the quantum space and the 12th dimensional grid, right? So if you haven't heard about the 12th dimensional grid, if you haven't heard about the Earth's experiment, go back onto my YouTube channel. There's a video that I did describing the 12th dimensional grid. It's a really, really powerful video. It's an extremely important video, and it describes what the 12th dimensional grid is and how every single experience, everything we feel, know, understand is in that 12th dimensional grid. All universes, all planets, all solar systems, everything. And it's a tiny little speck compared to everything else that's beyond it, okay? So we're in this kind of holding zone as a higher consciousness for a moment, almost like trying to get our bearings. Okay, and in this holding zone is also where you enter into the human form. It's where you create your Akashic record. It's where you bring in your guides. It's where you make contracts with other beings that are going to be your family or your partners, your relationships, right? It's the same holding zone. So you're going back to this same zone, the same dimensional portal. Okay, from that space, you're sort of settling in like, okay, you can look and you can see your entire life. You can see all the other lives that played out. You can see all of the humans that were associated with your human life, right? This is when we as the human really feel these spirits. We feel them close to us. We feel them connected. So typically when a spirit passes, they will stay in that holding zone. Not all the time, but many of them will stay in that holding zone for a little bit. Now, time is a now moment for the higher dimensional consciousness, okay? So they're there and then they can depart and go somewhere else. We may feel them there for quite some time. So a lot of times when a spirit dies, when a higher consciousness leaves and the physical form dies, we feel them around us for a while, right? And we're like, oh, I can really feel them. And then all of a sudden, as the days and the weeks go by, you don't feel them as much, right? Typically, the spirit or higher consciousness doesn't stay in that realm. Once they're in that realm, they get to choose. So they either choose to come back down into another human form, create a completely different life, completely separate Akashic record that has nothing to do with the life they just lived, right? It's completely separate. If they accidentally passed and they weren't supposed to pass in that human form, they may jump right back down, right? Oh my God, I got to get back down. I want to finish this, right? But it's always a choice. No higher consciousness is in any sort of karmic cycle where they have to go back down. That doesn't make sense in a higher dimensional frequency. There's no such thing as have tos. It's all choice, free will, and sovereignty. Every human life, every human incarnation is a choice, no matter what. There is no karmic cycle that forces a higher consciousness to have to drop back down. That is a very dense, very third dimensional paradigm. A forcing, a requiring, a making a higher consciousness do something because of some way or rule? No. So it's always a choice, okay? So once they are in that holding platform, they can stay there for a little while, they can engage, they can drop back into human form, or they can go back to the consciousness they existed in prior to dropping into human form, which most of the consciousnesses do. Even if they're going to reincarnate back into human form, many consciousnesses go back to the consciousness they existed in prior to dropping in. For instance, if you were an angelic being and you came from the angelic realm, you're going to go back to that angelic consciousness and rest, so to speak. Drop back into who you are, right? And then you're going to say, okay, I'm going back in. Remember, there is no time. Time doesn't exist in this realm, okay? So it happens in a now moment. If you're a Pleiadian and you're from the Pleiadian consciousness, most likely you're going to go back to that consciousness for however much time. And you're either going to stay or you're going to just choose to go back down, or you're going to go elsewhere, right? No, you know what? I want to go over and experience the angelic consciousness for a little bit. There's an infinite amount of experiences that you can have. You don't have to incarnate down into human form. Or maybe you choose to incarnate into another form on the earth plane, right? It's up to you as the higher consciousness. When we feel, as the human down here, when we speak to the dead, when we speak to the spirits, we're speaking to them in that holding zone. So here's where it can get a little complicated. Remember, it's quantum, and remember that in any now, consciousness can be experienced in many different fields. So for instance, if a grandfather just passed, or let's say a grandfather passed 6 months ago, and his higher consciousness was in that holding zone, and then he chose to go back into his consciousness that he existed in. Let's say he was from the Orion system. So his consciousness is in the Orion system. But we still connect to him in that holding zone. So it's almost as if he's in two places at the same time, okay? And what happens is this consciousness, this holding zone, when we tap into it, it's almost as if we are shooting our antenna to where that consciousness is, okay? So for instance, you're tapping into your grandfather that was at one now moment holding himself in that holding zone, but now he is in the Orion system. So you, as the human, are tapping into his consciousness in the holding zone, yet he in his consciousness is in the Orion. So there's this double antenna that's happening, right? You're connecting to his consciousness here, even though his consciousness is now in the Orion system. So it's like a boom, boom, right? The consciousness doesn't hang here. He does not stay here. Okay, but that's how we connect. It's like almost like we tap into the ghost aspect of him, and we're actually shooting the antenna by connecting to that ghost aspect. We are tapping into, it's leading us directly to where he is residing, where his consciousness is. So if we didn't have that sort of holding zone, it would be very challenging to reconnect with the dead. That's why it's so easy to connect to spirits and the dead, so to speak, because there's still an aspect of them in that holding zone, which is around a fourth and fifth dimensional field. And the reason that we feel them as that human is because that consciousness is very human-like to us still, right? And so when we tap in, we're also connecting to the consciousness that he's at, wherever he's at. And yet it feels like it's very close. You can smell him, you can hear him, you know, he's right here. And yet he's actually in the Orion consciousness, right? So it's a little complicated, but that's how it works. That's how we connect with spirit. It's this kind of platform, even though they may not actually be there. Now, in the beginning, when they first depart, they are right there prior to exiting the entire earth plane field and moving back, okay? And so once they're back wherever they went, they get to choose what they want to do next. Are they going to come back in? Or are they not going to come back in? when they're in that holding zone, there isn't necessarily a life review because they can see it in a now moment exactly what they did, exactly what they played out. So it's almost like it's a one big picture that they look at. It's like, oh yeah, that's what I did, I saw, I experienced, that's awesome, right? If they choose. Many don't choose to have any sort of recognition of what occurred because it's in their light, it's in their consciousness. They know what they experienced, they know what they did, right? So they don't need to have a life review and watch what occurred. What are the lessons that I learned, right? What are the contracts that I had? It's all in a now moment from a higher consciousness. It's inside of them. They already know, just like that. Because see, we are third dimensional, so we try to understand this with third dimensional paradigms. We're trying to understand this from the perspective of, oh, well, there must be lessons that we're learning. And so when we die, there must be lessons that we look at. Did we learn them or did we not learn them, right? There are no lessons to learn on the earth plane. There are experiences to be had. That's it. The third dimensional paradigm, the third dimensional consciousness, this spectrum creates lessons. Oh, we're supposed to be learning lessons, right? That's a very sort of fear-based way of looking at life almost, because it's like, well, did you learn your lesson? If you didn't learn your lesson, you better learn the lesson because it's going to come again. It's very fear-based, right? It's all just experiences. The higher consciousness doesn't care whether it learned a lesson or not. The higher consciousness is just here to experience the earth plane and do what it came down to do based on the blueprint, which is typically some sort of experience. Whether it's being a light worker, whether it's being just a volunteer who is experiencing life, who's never waking up, never ascending, they're just experiencing their life and their Akashic records, right? So it's not about, oh my God, I need to have a life review so I can look at all my lessons and make sure that I learned them correctly, because if I didn't, then I got to go back down and relearn them. That's fear-based. That's a paradigm in third dimension that doesn't exist beyond the 3D. It doesn't exist. It's not there, right? But you get to have all your opinions and all your beliefs and all your truths. And if that resonates with you, then that's your truth. And you get to hold every truth that you want, right? I'm just sharing what the Galactic Federation of Light has shared with me, right? So from that landing, that fourth and fifth dimensional sort of platform, you can drop right back down again. Boom, just like this, right? So a lot of times a light being or a higher consciousness will drop right back down into a baby in your same family, right? So all of a sudden, let's say your grandfather passes and then your sister has a child within a year, all right? And all of a sudden that child is holding that grandfather's energy. That happens all the time, right? So it's your soul group. You guys are staying together, right? And just like, God, I can see my grandfather in my niece or in my nephew or whatever it may be, right? That's if the spirit drops, the higher consciousness drops right back down. So that's kind of the overview of death, okay? There's probably going to be a lot of questions, and I'm sure I could go into much more detail on this. And maybe most likely I'll do a part 2. I'm just trying to give a large overview. If you have questions about this, go ahead and put them down below in the comments. I'll do a part 2, kind of looking at the questions and trying to, bring the questions together and decide how to do part 2 of this. Because I know that there are questions. Hopefully this gave you a little bit of a broader perspective of what happens. Remember that death is typically designed, not always, but it's designed. Not necessarily the way in which you die, okay, but the when of when you die. So not the exact date and time, because the higher consciousness isn't going to know that, right? But the time frame of your lifespan, right? If you've chosen to have a very long life, you're probably going to die between the age of 80 and 100. If you chose to have a short lifespan, you're probably going to die between the age of 5 and 15, right? Somewhere like that, right? So we don't want to look at it as like, oh, well, then did I choose to die on this day, on this time, in this way? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. The way in which somebody chooses to die may have been planned prior and may not have been planned. Okay, so for instance, there were many people that died during 9/11, right? Many of those chose to experience that, and many of them didn't. It was an accident, right? So again, you want to hold the death sort of story and paradigm very loosely, okay? Because there's a lot of different ways that it can be experienced, which is why there's so many questions around it. And there's no direct way of it unraveling. You absolutely choose it. It absolutely occurs when you say it's going to occur. It's absolutely the way you want it to be, higher consciousness, and that's it, right? Or it's completely by random and chance. You have no idea when it's going to happen, and you don't have any choice around it. It's all of the above, okay? But for the majority of higher consciousnesses, it is chosen. We've created it prior. And not always how we're going to do it or how we're going to experience it, okay? Because we always have free will. We are always jumping timelines. And if we have a timeline where we're going to perhaps, let's just say, end our life, right? Suicide. And we're on that timeline, right? And that is what we have designed from a higher consciousness, then that may play out. It's also possible that because you have decided to consciously ascend at the same time, you may, as the ego personality, decide to switch timelines, right? And you move into another timeline and you recorrect and you choose a different way, right? And the higher self is like, okay, we're going this way, right? We've jumped timelines and we're no longer going to follow what we had originally planned. That happens as well. Okay, so there's many different ways that this unravels. It's complicated and yet simple. Many people plan their deaths and then they do the death, right? Unconsciously. Many people don't plan to have that death, accidentally find themselves in there and then pass. And again, remember that the physical pain of it is rarely felt. It is felt, but not as often as we think it is. The spirit leaves, the light leaves beforehand, okay? So hopefully this made some sense. You know, it either resonates or it doesn't resonate. There's so many different ways of experiencing it, of feeling it, of understanding it, okay? So this is just one perspective. Don't hold this as the absolute. If there's any questions, please send them down below and I will read them and do a part 2 of this. I love you so much. Thank you for listening to this. I'm sending you so much love. Take care of yourself. Be gentle with yourself. I'll see you next time.